last time I shared an observation that it just seems like I'm hearing a lot of people talking about what are we as Christians supposed to make of what's going on right now in the Middle East. And there's a lot of speculation, and that's fine. I think that there's a place for good, righteous thinking about things. But I immediately say, in times of confusion, I need clarity. In times when things aren't uncertain, I immediately want to go to, so what is certain? Kind of like the psalmist writes in Psalm 11, when the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? You know what we do? We remember the Lord is in his holy temple. He is on his heavenly throne. He observes everyone on earth. His eyes examine them. The Lord is righteous. He loves justice. The upright will see his face. So what gives us clarity in times like this? How are we to respond? Last time I shared with you some principles that I thought are helpful to remember. You know, that God is sovereign, that only Jesus brings peace, that broken people always fight, and that's why there's fighting there. Let's not just think that it's because of something special that's happening there. Broken people always are fighting. There's never been a time without war in the world, sadly. The next thing I think it's important for us to remember that truth matters. Times like this, it's important to remember that justice matters because God is a God of justice. Remember, Jesus said in John 7:24, stop judging according to outward appearances, judge according to righteous judgments. Jesus actually expects us to make righteous judgments because he is the ultimate judge. The Bible says in Acts 17:31, because he has set aside a day when he is going to judge the world in righteousness by the man that he has appointed. He has provided proof of this by raising him from the dead. Jesus is the judge, and one day he's going to come back and judge. What really matters right now is us making right judgments, because it doesn't matter in a sense who wins or loses the war. Ultimately, it doesn't. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what side do I want to be on. Ultimately, what matters is what does the just judge say? How do I judge with righteous judgment? 2 Corinthians 5:10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be repaid for what is done in the body, whether good or evil. It's like Thomas Jefferson said, I fear that God is just and that his justness will not be silent forever. So we have to remember in times like this, truth matters. Justice matters. The danger in times like this is that we won't automatically think, now what's the truth here? What's God's justice here? But we'll go to one extreme or the other. We'll pick a side and then justify whatever that side does. So on the one hand, there are those who would say, like, Israel, right or wrong, I'm going to be for Israel. No matter what Israel does, I'm going to be pro-Israel. You know, it's kind of like, because they're God's people, and someday God's going to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Therefore, it doesn't matter what Israel does, I'm for Israel. God never took that position. Right? God was certainly for Israel, but he didn't always say whatever they do is okay. In fact, most of the Old Testament is filled. Read the book of I'm reading Jeremiah right now. Devotional. It's like Jeremiah. Most of what Israel does, God condemns at that point. So God is not Israel right or wrong. The other extreme that people will go to is the extreme of saying, again, I referred to this last time, that, because the Palestinians are weak, they're always right. Israel shouldn't attack them back because it's just not fair. Israel's strong, Palestinians weak. Again, just if I can give you an opinion, I don't think that it's a coincidence that the very same people who fight for social justice causes, the very same people who are pro-abortion, the very same people who are for LGBTQ rights, the very same people who desacralize the things that God calls sacred, are the very same people who are defending Hamas right now. They're the very same people who seem to turn a blind eye at the evil that Hamas has done. And they're calling for ceasefire. Why? Because they've desacralized what's sacred. They've made themselves the ultimate judge, and they ultimately judge things according to the narrative. I've shared this with you before, that big is bad, small is good. The narrative is David and Goliath. The Bible actually gives the narrative in a way. You know, David, the little guy, Goliath, the big guy. David, they would argue, is morally right because he is the weak guy. Goliath is morally bad because he's the strong guy. We would say, no. David is right because he's on God's side, because he's doing God's will. Goliath is evil because he is fighting God, because he's resisting God, because he's doing evil things. And so in this situation, we can't just say Hamas is okay, the Palestinians come to their defense because they're weak. Or Israel, we're on their side because they're Israel. We have to say, the whole time we have to say, okay, what is just? What does the Bible say is right? Okay. Having said that, let's be very clear that while the conflict is never simple, war is never simple, it's not hard to have clarity in some matters. What the Hamas did was clearly evil. Their targeting of civilians and their treatment of children and their raping and trying to inflict as much pain and terror as possible is horrible. By the way, and there are people who are like, well, Israeli children and Palestinian children matter just the same. Well, yes, they do. But the difference is Israel is doing their best to minimize civilian casualties. Israel is doing its best to, from what I understand, to live by what we would consider biblically just war principles. Hamas doesn't care. They are purposefully targeting the innocent and children and civilians. So defeating Hamas is not just pragmatic, it's moral. C.S. Lewis one time made the observation, if war is ever justified, peace is sometimes wrong. If war is ever right, peace is sometimes evil. See, God called for the destruction of nations in the Old Testament, and sometimes people who don't understand justice and love and how the two fit together, they'll judge God as being immoral for that. It's like, no. God was actually loving in that. That was moral. We didn't lack clarity after Pearl Harbor. That generation didn't. That generation did not say, we need to call a ceasefire to Japan, against Japan. When the Germans are invading, there were some that said, hey, let's not fight the Germans. Let's have a ceasefire. And what happened? 6 million Jews were killed as a result of people who thought that they were pleading for peace. They were pleading for the injustice. Justice means that people get what they deserve. Justice means we say, this is wrong, it must be stopped. Again, we have to remember there's coming a day when we will all stand before the judgment throne of God. And what he calls good and evil and what he says to do is right. More on this later, but that's why it's really important for us to understand that when Israel attacks Hamas, they act as God's agent of justice because God has given them the right and responsibility to inflict justice after this injustice. I've heard, by the way, that proportionally the number of Jews killed by Hamas on October 7th equals 30 9/11s in the United States. Now let that sink in for a second. Can you imagine if on 9/11, 30 cities in the United States had experienced what was experienced in New York City and in DC. If that had happened 30, you think people would be, yeah, there would probably be some people who don't have a sense of morality that would be like, oh yeah, we can't fight back. It's the wrong thing to do. It'll cycle of violence will be, no. There'd be the moral clarity that says that kind of evil has to be stopped so it doesn't happen, so other people don't get killed by it, hurt by it in the future. Next principle on this, by the way, is how can we talk in these terms? I mean, isn't life sacred? Yes, but so is justice. Human life is sacred, but one of the things the cross teaches us is that justice actually matters more than temporary human life. Any humanist can say life matters above all. But Jesus goes to the cross and gives his life. Why? To satisfy justice so we can be saved. There are some things that matter more than human life. And justice and love are two of those things. Paul says the state, God has organized the world. He's organized governments to govern people, to govern families, churches, to kind of oversee society so there can be peace. But then he's said they are instituted as God's servants. This is why historically in the West, many governments have actually been organized as ministries. Even in the Soviet Union, remember, they have the ministry of this and the ministry of that. Why? Because they saw themselves as ministers of God. In other words, God is the one who's in authority. God has given them responsibility. As they carry out God's responsibility, they are serving God by serving people under God's authority, doing what God has called them to do. He is God's servant for good. And the good there, by the way, is defined here in Romans 13 and other places as doing justice. That's why at the end of Romans 12, the Bible can say, or Paul can say, hey, don't take revenge. It's God's, to leave room for God's wrath. But just a couple of verses later, Paul understands and he says, and who is the one who brings God's wrath? The state. He is God's servant and avenger to bring wrath on those who do wrong. And when the state doesn't take the responsibility to be a servant of God, to punish evil through bearing the sword, the state is actually complicit in evil.